Mr. Kennedy. Still alive, I see. So, do you like my garden?
Every so often when I'm playing through a game for the first time, I'll reach a section that seems to perfectly encapsulate all of the best aspects of that game. And Resident Evil 4 is no stranger to this. Honestly, the game does so many things well that I could talk about a number of set pieces in the game, but my favorite section by far is the castle hedge maze you encounter about halfway through the game. It's easily one of my favorite set pieces in any game I've ever played, and until now I haven't really put pen to paper or video clip to timeline to figure out the why. So if you'll indulge me and give me a small portion of your lunch break in between bites of your leftover Chinese food, I'd like to take a look at Resident Evil 4 just to see what makes this game so great, and hopefully get to the root of why I love the hedge maze so damn much. The fourth entry in the Resident Evil series marked a pretty significant shift in the franchise, and the shift was definitely intentional. Game producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi started to recognize following the release of Resident Evil 0 in 2002 that it was more of the same product the company had been making since 1996, and that it was due for change. Another catalyst for this was due to poor sales on the previously mentioned Resident Evil 0 and a remake of the original Resident Evil game that came out in 2002 as well. So change the formula they did. Most recognizable was doing away with the fixed camera model that they were familiar with and opting to crank up the amount of action. In an attempt to reach a wider audience, Capcom worked hard to fine-tune a balance between traditional horror and high entertainment. The process was difficult, greatly increasing the development time and resulting in the project being scrapped about 4 times until they could find the secret sauce. Their end result sees a large focus on keeping the game as tense as possible through gameplay mechanics. They decided to keep the restrictive tank controls in the game that the previous games were known for, and if you wanted to shoot at any point, Leon would have to plant his feet and raise his gun before you could do anything. These might seem like minor adjustments to gameplay, but they become extremely important when you have several enemies quickly closing in, and it helps to increase the tension as you decide if it's better to fight it out or make your escape. While the inventory management is much less of a concern in this game compared to its predecessors, it starts off pretty restrictive, forcing the player to make decisions about if they want to hold onto that flash grenade for a little bit longer, or use it now to get out of a tricky situation. The game also introduces the Merchant, well known for his quotable lines and resources he provides to the player throughout the game. Upgrades to your weapons can get very expensive, but each upgrade feels substantial in increasing your survivability. The Merchant rooms serve as a clear opposite to the dangerous areas of the game, much like the safe rooms in previous titles. Every person that has played this game knows that release of tension that you feel when you enter the next room and you are greeted with that blue flame. So let's take a look at the first major encounter of the game, the village fight, and see how these elements come together in order to make a tense environment for the player. So right off the bat, when you enter the area, you have the opportunity to scope out the area and observe all the villagers just doing seemingly normal things. This already sets a tone that isn't in any of the previous games. By having the camera behind the player, they're able to open up the area more and allow for more player navigation, so they can put stuff in these houses throughout the village. When the enemies do start attacking you, they attack in higher numbers and they're faster and smarter, so they're much more threatening than their bumbling counterparts in the previous games. Since this is early on, your supplies are severely limited, and this encourages the player to move around the area and seek shelter, and maybe if they're lucky, find a shotgun. And as the fight progresses, enemies begin to spawn in different locations, including behind where the player first entered the area, and that just thrusts them into even more tense and unsafe environments. Designing the game in this way was a new method to inspire fear into the series by putting the player up against these smarter, more unrelenting forces. Now this falters a little bit near the end of the game as your arsenal of weapons increase. This ends up shifting the game naturally towards a more action-focused experience where you're fighting more enemies and you're not really as scared when you're playing the game. That is, until you meet the Regenerators. If you're unfamiliar with the Regenerators, they're an enemy that you don't see until near the end of the game, and they have this gimmick where you can shoot off their limbs, but eventually those limbs will grow back, and shooting off their limbs doesn't kill them. The only way to actually kill them is either to do enough damage to them, which is very difficult and bad for resources, or if you have the infrared scope, you can put that on a sniper rifle, and that'll allow you to see all the parasites that exist inside the Regenerator, and if you shoot all of those, that'll actually kill the Regenerator. But when you first encounter them, you don't have that at all. By adding a gimmick to how the Regenerators are killed, the developers are able to once again strip away a significant amount of resources for the player, and suddenly, the game is horrifying again. I think the biggest mistake they made with these guys was providing the player with the infrared scope so early after introducing them. I think it would have been really interesting to see how different things would be if they didn't include the infrared scope at all or included it much later in the game. While Capcom wanted to move away from the fixed camera model they were familiar with using, this introduced a new problem for level design. When it comes to creating content for a large audience, the more you place in the hands of the viewer, the more you have to account for different user experiences. Let's use the example of video games and movies to really explain this. In a movie, the presentation is exactly the same for every person consuming it. What you see presented on the screen is specifically crafted by the production team to portray the story and experience they're attempting to share. If something is important to creating that experience for the viewer, they have the ability to focus on whatever that thing is. With the video game, the player almost acts as another member of the production team, choosing what is most important to focus on at one time. If something really intense is about to happen, but the player is more focused on the wall decor, that can really detract from the experience the developers are attempting to create. When the team was working with a fixed camera model, they had control over what the player saw at any given time. And while there are some limitations to directing how the player decides to approach each of these sections, it still allows them to have full control over what is being presented on the screen, like this enemy in the mirror in Resident Evil Remake. But for Resident Evil 4, you don't have the luxury of having full control over the camera. The player has that control, and it's important to make sure your level design directs the player in such a way as to make sure those important story beats and moments get hit in just the right way. I think each area in Resident Evil 4 kind of boils down to 3 different level design categories. You have the out and back steakhouse. You start at point A, and your goal is to navigate through the area to get either a key item or activate something, which would be at point B, and then eventually you return back to point A to leave the level and go on to the next section. Another category is just passing through. This is where you start at point A, and your goal is to reach point B by taking care of whatever objective that area of the game has. That can be as simple as killing all the enemies or activating something in the area, or just plain moving from point A to point B. And the third section is, dear God, just please survive this. In this example, you basically hold your position for however long you need to until you reach the objective. These are the sections where you basically have to last a certain amount of time or kill enough enemies until whatever objective you have is met. By keeping things simple for how progression is made and just keeping most of the areas down to these core categories, the focus can be placed on ensuring each area has a unique charm to it. Let's look at a few sections within the same category to demonstrate this idea. So the cabin fight, the minecart ride, and the Verdugo boss fight all fit within the DGJPST category, but each has a different vibe that the developers were able to create. The cabin fight is claustrophobic and tense because there are enemies coming from all directions and things quickly become overwhelming as you try to survive long enough. The Verdugo fight is horrifying because you're trying to survive against an extremely quick enemy in this tight, closed space, and it's very hard to actually kill him unless you know exactly what you're doing. And the minecart ride is more action-oriented as you attempt to just keep enemies from climbing into your cart. Before I move on to the next chapter, I want to quickly mention one of my favorite level design aspects in the game. While the game is largely linear, there are some sections, particularly the village portion of the game where you return to areas you've previously been to, but the context is changed to make them feel unique and even more horrifying than they were when you first were there. There is something I just love about spending time in an area and becoming familiar with every nook and cranny, and then when night hits, all of a sudden these areas are completely different and you all of a sudden feel like you don't know this area as well as you used to. Recently, I was playing through the game Subnautica for the first time, and while this game is very different from Resident Evil 4, there were plenty of moments where I had a pit in my stomach as I did when I first played RE4 about 14 years ago. If you're unfamiliar, Subnautica is an underwater exploration game with a very large world containing a variety of biomes, some more dangerous than others. One time while traveling near the edge of the game world, I came across an area that was referred to as the ecological dead zone, and this happened. The feeling of seeing pure darkness, while any sound that was there before completely drops out, was so frightening, and it stuck with me because instead of making a loud sound or a jump scare, the game actually pulled away a bunch of the stimuli that I had, and they used that to scare me. The developers recognize that sometimes the best way to scare a player is to actually make them come up with the fear. Now, Resident Evil 4 has some excellent sound design. In fact, a lot of the sounds that I'm using in this video are from the game. Enemies have a tendency to say stuff as they approach you, especially when they're coming at you from behind. This is definitely creepy, but it has this practical effect of directing the player to whatever threat is actually there. And another great thing about it is the dialogue is intensely memorable, so eventually you just start associating voices with the enemy types. Like, this dude has that voice, and that guy is definitely saying that line. And while the music isn't really something I'd bump to in the car, trust me, I've tried. It does a great job of adding to the experience. You see, for most situations in Resident Evil 4, the music only tends to play when an enemy is aggroed onto you. As soon as you kill the final enemy in an area, the music quickly fades away. Hearing the music fade after fighting through an onslaught of enemies causes such a release of tension that the player quickly begins to associate the lack of music with safety, whether they realize that or not. And any expectation can be easily exploited by the developer if they choose to do so. So this brings us to my favorite section of Resident Evil 4, the culmination of all the elements and categories and chapters I've been talking about to create the perfect area in the game. The reason why I'm making this video in the first place. Now, I'm not really sure why I have a fascination with mazes. There's just something about not knowing what's around each corner that makes me want to look. So just a brief description for those who might not be familiar with this area, or as I just found, if you played on easy mode, this section's actually completely cut from the game, so if you ever did that, then 1, go play it on normal mode because this area is amazing, and 2, I don't think I had a second point. The Hedge Maze fits within the out and back category, where you navigate through the maze to find 2 key pieces that are located somewhere within the maze, and those will be used to unlock a door that leads you to the next area of the game. Throughout the maze, there are several dogs infected with the same virus as the other enemies. Some of them are locked in cages that they will eventually escape and come after you, and others will ambush you at unexpected moments. With this game's switch from fixed camera to third person, the hedge walls act to guide the player to keep the camera in the exact direction the devs want them to. This helps to script out sections where the dogs will pop up in an area where maybe the player has already been to catch them off guard. Now, instead of playing music throughout this section, the developers opted to not play anything at all when you're in the maze, just keeping all sound limited to this minimalist soundscape with some crickets and occasionally the growling dog. This goes against what the player has been engineered to expect in the game up to this point. Suddenly, that silence that used to be used to release tension and make you feel safe is doing the exact opposite because you don't know what to expect. There's this mystery involved with going into this maze and trying to find everything you need to before leaving. Suddenly, you want to get out of there as quickly as possible, taking turns that maybe you've already taken before, and you end up doubling back to an area you thought was new when it turns out you were already there. The Hedge Maze does so many different things to scare the player and make them feel tense throughout the entire experience. So even when you leave the Hedge Maze and you go up and use that key item that you've been looking for, you're still scared. Where the majority of Resident Evil strives to be this fun, action-oriented game, the Hedge Maze seeks to rekindle some of that horror that its predecessors had, and I know that I'm not the only person that is still scared by this section after playing through it so many times.
Right now,
It's too much. I mean, even I'm at the point with Resident Evil 4, I've played it so many goddamn times that I basically know where every enemy is, except there's one part, if you played the game, that I still can't do. It terrifies the shit out of me. The Hedge Maze with the dogs with the fucking octopuses in their back. It's terrifying.
I still need to play it.
It's terrifying, and I've played it 15 times probably, and it scares the shit out of me. I hate that part.
Thanks for watching.